friends, all prophecy fulfilled, where we are looking at the Gentiles, Christianity's best kept secret. And you might be thinking, Tom Petty, refugee, what does that have to do with anything? It's thematic, folks. It's thematic, and it's going to make a lot more sense at the end of this thing. Trust me. So you got to wait for it. Wait for it. Okay, Romans chapter 1. We were in their last lesson. We are in the latter part of Romans chapter 1. So if you didn't see that video, you might want to look at that first before watching this, because there we looked at some contextual clues within the text that are going to help us as we go through this. But here we go. Now, Romans chapter 1. Whoever these people are that Paul is talking about, and we know that Gentiles are in view, we've already talked about that, but whoever these people are that he's describing, man, he is really painting an ugly picture, isn't he? Yeah, he is. And I know that most people, probably you out there listening to this, you probably think or assume that really this is kind of a commentary on the depraved nature of humanity and his proclivity towards sin, and it's an ugly picture of all mankind and our tendency for debauchery and all that kind of iniquity. Well, hold on that for a second, okay? I want you to pay attention to the pronouns, the theys, the thems, the theirs, okay? You know, it's almost as if Paul is talking specifically about a particular group of people. So anyway, you're going to need a finger in Romans chapter 1 and a finger in Hosea chapter 4, and we are going to be going back and forth. So, Paul's talking about the gospel. He's not ashamed of it. It's the power of God for salvation for all who believe, Jew and the Greek. The gospel is the righteousness of God, and it's revealed in all that jazz. But in verse 18, he says about the gospel, in relation to the gospel, that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now, men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. You know what? If we flip back to Hosea chapter 4, we're going to see something oh so similar. God charged Israel in verse 1. He said, there is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. That was the problem. Israel suppressed the truth of God that was given to them through the law. A law that was only given to them. Only to them. They suppressed it. They stomped it down, and they covered it up with their idolatry. In fact, in verse 19, Paul continues. He says, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. Now look, I know that sometimes we look at this and we generalize. We tend to think, oh, well, what is known of God is manifest. It's manifest everywhere. In fact, verse 20 talks about, invisible attributes. So we look around, birds, bees, nature, mountains, and all that. And that's how God has shown us. That's how God has manifested himself to us. Right? Well, no, good luck finding a verse with that. And I know you're thinking, wait a minute, how about Psalm 19:1? The heavens declare the glory of God and all that. Well, no, actually, that's actually a prophetic utterance about God's people declaring the glory of God and all that. But here's what we do know. Okay, we know that God made known to them, he made known to Israel himself through his law. Israel rejected God and knowledge of God by rejecting the law. So God said he was rejecting them because, turning back to Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, because you have forgotten the law of your God. This is the entire sweeping indictment upon Israel in Hosea. Israel forgot. Israel suppressed what was made known to them and manifest in them and to them. And it's the same idea in Romans 1, verse 21, where they were responsible for knowing, Paul says. They knew God. They did not glorify God. Although they knew God, they did not glorify Him. Israel knew Yahweh. In fact, Israel knew Him through the law, but only Yahweh knew Israel. Vice versa, same thing. Amos 3, 1 and 2, hear the word of the Lord hath spoken against you, O children of Israel, against the whole family which I brought up from the land of Egypt, saying, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore, I will punish you for all your iniquities. Now, did you catch that? With knowledge comes responsibility for that knowledge. Reject that knowledge, what happens? And you're going to face the consequences, which according to Amos are punishment. And according to Hosea chapter 4, verse 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you for being priest for me. And that's the exact same idea again later on in Romans chapter 1, verse 28. And even as they did not retain God in their knowledge. You can only retain knowledge if you've first been given knowledge. Rejecting knowledge is the same thing as not retaining knowledge. 4:6, the second half of the verse in Hosea, I will reject you for being priests for me because you have forgotten the law of your God. They did not retain that knowledge. This was their story. Psalm 106:21, they forgot God, their Savior, who had done great things in Egypt. We see that all over the prophets. You can only forget something or someone that you already know, folks. They knew Yahweh through their exclusive covenant with Him, but they exchanged Him for idols. They knew His law, but they suppressed the law. They suppressed that knowledge. They knew His covenant, but they forsook it. That was Israel's indictment. They knew but forsook. They knew but suppressed. They knew but did not retain. They behaved no better than the Gentiles or the nations who did not have Yahweh's laws. Gentiles that did not know God. Therefore, God said, okay, you want to be Gentiles, you want to be like pagans, you want to be like strangers to me, have at it. And so it was. So, in verse 20, Romans chapter 1, Paul said, they are without excuse. Now look, I don't know about the pagan in South Africa 2,000 years before Christ. I don't really know about the Aborigine in Australia at the time of Christ. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know about the person today who's living in a remote place wherever in Africa. I don't know. Maybe every single individual, is responsible for the light that they do have, or the knowledge that they're privy to. And in that sense, hey, maybe everybody is without excuse. I don't know. That's fine. But you know what? That's not what Romans chapter 1 is about. So we can speculate all we want. But what we do know is that we see Paul here using Hosea chapter 4 to make his point that they are without excuse. Hosea chapter 4 is all about Israel's culpability, their guilt, and how they were without excuse. That's the point. To them were given the oracles of God, and by that they would be judged. In fact, just one chapter a little bit ahead, Hosea chapter 5, verse 1, he says to Israel, to Ephraim, yours is the judgment. Judgment is always tied to law. The law brings wrath. Remember, Paul's talking about God's wrath here in verse 18, right? For the wrath of God is revealed. He's talking about the gospel. And essentially he's saying, hey, you've got people who are going to accept this gospel. You've got those who are not. Those who are not will experience the wrath of God. That will be revealed. It's all about the wrath of God. John the Baptist comes preaching in the wilderness, right? He's talking to the Jewish leaders, Israel's leaders, and he says, hey, who warned you to flee from the wrath about to come? The wrath, the judgment is always tied to Israel. Always. 4, verse 3, again, back in Hosea, what's going to happen? He says, the land will mourn and waste away. In 4:6, again, he says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. In 4:14 of Hosea, people who do not understand, that's Israel, will be trampled. Later on in chapter 5, verse 10, he says, I will pour out my wrath on them, Israel, or Judah. He's talking about Judah there, like water. But Ephraim, there's the other kingdom, Ephraim is oppressed, and they're broken in judgment. It's all about wrath, the wrath of God. But wait a minute. Paul's talking about the wrath of God in chapter 1, verse 18. That's about to be revealed. Now, I want you to think about this. Verse 21. Let's move on up to verse 21. These people who are going to experience the wrath of God, these people who are without excuse, okay? These people, it says, because although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were they thankful, but they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. In verse 22, he says, professing to be wise, they became fools. Now, I've had people quote that to me about me, saying, you think you're so wise, you are nothing but a fool. Oh, professing to be wise, Ryan, you have become a fool. Well, maybe I have, but that's not what Paul's talking about either, okay? Who became fools? Well, according to Hosea, flip back to Hosea, Hosea 4, Romans 1. Hosea 4, Romans 1, okay? We're going to be flip, because they're basically mirror images is what they are. In 4:14, Israel is a people who do not understand. This is why they were without excuse. They had Yahweh's law. They should have been wise to it and under it, but a lack of understanding, that's the same thing as being unwise. It's the same thing as being foolish. They're really synonymous terms, and we see that, we see that all throughout the prophets. Like in the last days, those who understood or those who were wise would come to understanding, that kind of a thing. Okay? Jeremiah 4:22, for my people are fools. They have not known me. There's your knowledge. They are foolish children without understanding. They are skilled in doing evil, but they do not know how to do good. Isaiah 44:18, they cannot comprehend or understand. For he has shut their eyes so they cannot see, and closed their minds so they cannot understand. This is Israel, folks. Paul mentions that their foolish hearts were darkened. Kind of sounds like a similar heart condition that we see here in Hosea chapter 4, verse 11. Harlotry, wine, new wine enslave the heart. So when I see Paul describing these Gentiles as futile, right, in their thoughts, foolish in their hearts, and their hearts are darkened, and he's pointing back to Hosea chapter 4, you know what this made me think of? Probably not. I'll tell you. Ephesians chapter 4, 17 and 18. Listen to this. Just listen. So I tell you this, and testify to it in the Lord. You must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and alienated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardness of their hearts. Did you catch that? These Ephesians are the same kind. They're the same type. They're the same. They are experiencing the same behaviors as the same Gentiles in Romans chapter 1. Futile thinking, darkened, enslaved hearts, no understanding. Right? That's the same description as Hosea chapter 4. But wait, Hosea is talking about Israelites who basically, like Paul says, are going to walk as the Gentiles do. Basically becoming, Gentile by virtue of their futile, foolish, darkened thinking. It's all Israel, folks. You seeing it? Come on, tell me you are. Okay, Romans chapter 1. Verse 24, verse 26, verse 28. God gave them up to uncleanliness. Okay, therefore God gave them up to uncleanliness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. Verse 26, for this reason God gave them up to vile passions. And in verse 28, it said, God gave them over to a debased mind. Now, the idea of God giving up Israel, or giving Israel over to idolatry, or something like that, that again is seen throughout the prophets. God often threatened it, and you know what? God did it. Turn back to Hosea chapter 4, verse 17. Ephraim is joined to idols. So you know what God says? Let him alone. Let him alone. In other words, just give him up. He's going to go his way. They're going to go their way. Give him up. Now, recapping the history of the house of Israel's rebellion from day one, going all the way back to the Exodus in the wilderness, right? Yahweh says this, Ezekiel 20, verse 23 and 25. So I raised my hand in an oath to those in the wilderness, there's Israel, that I would scatter them among the Goyim, the Gentiles, and I would disperse them throughout the countries. I also gave them over to statutes that were not good and ordinances by which they could not live. So that's the picture. God is withdrawing himself from them, and he's saying, okay, have it your way. Just like Subway. Isn't that Subway's motto? Have it your way. Have it your way, Israel. So in Hosea chapter 5, verse 6, he says, he has withdrawn himself. He's given them up. When God withdraws, he's given them up. He's leaving them to their own devices. Folks, it's really not that complicated. This is simply Israel becoming not my people. Psalm 81:12. So I gave them up to their stubborn hearts to follow their own devices. Now, I don't know if you caught that, but in Romans 1, verse 24, Paul said that he gave them up to uncleanness. I always thought it was uncleanliness, but uncleanness, it says. Now, it sounds to me like Israel, it sounds to me like these people Paul is describing, they're dirty, they're defiled, and they're kind of rolling around in the slop of pagan nations. Yeah, that's what it does sound like. And you know what else? That's exactly how Hosea describes Israel. Hosea chapter 5, verse 5, he says, Israel is defiled. They're dirty. Check this out. I just read Ezekiel 20, 23, and 25 for you. Now, I'm going to read that again. But I'm going to go one verse more to verse 26. And this really is a mic drop of a verse, if there ever was one, because this really says it all about Israel. Here we go. I'll say it again. I raised my hand in an oath to those in the wilderness that I would scatter them among the Gentiles and disperse them in the countries because they have not executed my judgment, but have despised my statutes, profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were fixed on their fathers' idols. Therefore, I gave them up to statutes which were not good and judgments by which they could not live, and I pronounce them unclean because of their ritual gifts. Now, I've got more to say about this uncleanness thing later on in the New Testament. We'll get to that when we get to the vision of Peter, and we got Cornelius and all that good stuff. We'll get to there. But look, Israel given up to idols. Israel unclean. They're unclean. Folks, if this isn't a mere image of what Paul is painting in Romans chapter 1, then I don't know what is. And that's because really they're describing the same people. Israel defiled. It's not Joe Blow pagan. It's not all humanity. He's talking about Israel specifically, what they have become, their condition. Verse 23 and verse 25, Romans chapter 1. He says, again, professing to be wise, they became fools. Well, what else happened? And changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. In verse 25, he says, talking about these same people who are unclean, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Well, let's flip back to Hosea chapter 4, verse 7. Right back there. What's he say? What's he say about Israel? What's Hosea says? He says, the more they increase, Israel, the more they increase, the more they sinned against me. I will change their glory into shame. Bam! But wait. There's more. How about Psalm 106, 19 through 21? They made a calf in Horeb and worshiped the molded image. Thus they changed their glory. Israel changed their glory into an image of an ox that eats grass. They forgot God, their Savior, who had done great things in Egypt. How about Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 11? Has a nation changed its gods, which are not gods? But my people, Israel, have changed their glory for what does not profit. Look, Israel's changing glory was a direct causal relationship to their changing their gods, to their idolatry. That's what it was. Hosea wasn't giving an indictment on all humanity. He was giving an indictment on Israel. And that's what Paul is doing. Paul is reiterating what Hosea was saying about Israel. Everything is rooted in law. Everything is rooted in covenant and the disobedience to that covenant and disobedience to that law and forsaking that law and going out and getting dirty and changing their glory to that which it was, those pagan nations, those Gentile nations. Everything's rooted in law. Everything. Verse 23, he continued on. After they were changing their glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. And he says, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Look, we've seen this a million times. I've talked about this in past lessons, right? This ain't that hard. Paul didn't just pull this out of a hat. No. This is straight out of the playbook of the prophets. Israel changed their glory through idolatry. They went from God's covenant sheep. I mean, they were always God's sheep, really, but they became lost sheep. But really, they became as unclean animals. They went from sheep to these unclean animals outside the commonwealth of Israel. In fact, back in Hosea chapter 4, back and forth, where we see these animals wasting away in judgment. The judgment is always a part of Israel, always a part of the law. But these animals are wasting away in judgment due to lack of knowledge of God in the land. So in Hosea chapter 4, verse 3, he says, therefore the land will mourn. They're going to mourn because this is a judgment. And everyone who dwells there will waste away with the beasts of the fields, the birds of the air, and even the fish of the sea will be taken away. How about Romans chapter 1, verse 29? These people who have been given over to a debased mind, they are being filled with all unrighteousness. And then from there, man, Paul just basically gives a long list, just a litany of sin after sin after sin and practice after practice, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, envy, murder, strife, deceit, blah, 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 blah. And he just keeps going on and on and on. Now, admittedly, we're going to turn to Hosea chapter 4. Admittedly, Paul seems to give a much more thorough and specific list here in Romans chapter 1. But you know what? It's really just the same picture that Hosea paints in Hosea chapter 4. Verse 2, by swearing, by lying, killing, stealing, committing adultery, they, Israel, Ephraim, break all restraint with bloodshed upon bloodshed. Breaking all restraint. They're out of control, folks. There's nothing they cannot, and there's nothing they will not do in their debased state of mind. They even sacrificed their own children, did they not? I mean, it's ugly. It's as if Israel wasn't really able to stop once that ball got rolling. That's what it seems like, right? Hosea chapter 4, verse 7. The more they increased, the more they sinned against me. That reminded me of later on in Hosea chapter 13, verse 1. He says, when Ephraim spoke, trembling, he exalted himself in Israel. But what happened? When he offended through Baal, there's your idolatry. When he offended through Baal, he died. Israel died. God withdrew. Now what happens? Now they sin more and more. They're out of control. They're breaking all restraint. They sin more and have made for themselves molded images. Man, this sounds just like the folks right here in Romans chapter 1. Breaking all restraint. Every sin imaginable seems to be fair game. And not only that, here's the kicker. Think about this. Not only that, these people that Paul is saying did these things, in verse 32, they are doing these things knowing the righteous judgment of God. What have we talked about? Knowledge and knowing, culpability, responsibility. I mean, I can only say this so many times before I get sick of hearing it myself. Only Israel knew God, His law, and knew His righteous judgment. Only Israel knew that. And these people in Romans chapter 1, they did all these things knowing. That's Israel, folks. Ladies and germs, Hosea laid it out. Paul confirmed it. Israel knew God, but Israel suppressed that knowledge. Israel worshipped idols. Israel exchanged the truth for a lie. Israel exchanged God's incorruptible glory and image and took on the image of foreign gods, wooden idols, corruptible beasts, birds, creeping things, by forsaking Yahweh's law. Right? The house of Israel became every bit the unclean, dirty, corruptible animals as the surrounding pagan nations to which they were scattered. There you have it. As the great theologian Tom Petty explained, here comes Paul, right? Here comes Paul in the last days, and he's saying, hey Israel, somewhere, somehow, somebody must have kicked you around some. Old Tom got it right. In other words, look, you've been kicked around, Israel. You've been beat up. You've been kicked into the nations, carried away to dumb idols, however you were led, right? Remember that? 2 Corinthians somewhere? It says, who knows? Who knows? However you were led. Maybe you were kidnapped, tied up, taken away, and held for ransom. Tell me, Israel, Tom Petty explains, why you want to lay there and revel in your abandon. Man, Professor Petty, man, he nailed this one, didn't he? Paul's saying, look, Israel, don't revel in your abandon. Don't do it. Yes, God withdrew, but no more. That's over. Come on in out of the rain. Come on in out of the dirty waters of your isolation. Get clean. Come home. Come into the covenant of Messiah. Come home, Israelites. Come home, lost sheep. You don't have to live like a refugee. Not anymore, you don't. All right, I'm done embarrassing myself. See you next lesson. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.
Somewhere, somehow, somebody must have